Hello everyone and welcome to this video podcast on the last days. My name is David and the title of this episode is Critiquing a Popular Last Days Timeline, Part 5, with a subtitle of Wrong, Wrong, and Wrong Again. This is episode 14. In this episode we will wrap up our critique of this podcaster's 7-year tribulation timeline by zeroing in on two target dates that are pivotal for the success of this podcaster's 7-year tribulation timeline. The first of these two target dates is the scheduled appearance of the two witnesses in Jerusalem midway through the 7-year tribulation time frame, and who are to testify or prophesy for a time period of 3.5 years, as recorded by the Apostle John in Revelation chapter 11, verse 3, which reads, "And I will give power unto my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth." The second of these two target dates is the scheduled appearance of Christ on the Mount of Olives at the end of the 7-year tribulation time frame, as recorded by the prophet Zechariah in Zechariah chapter 14, verse 4, which reads, "And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, and half of the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it toward the south," and so forth. Now it is these two scheduled events and target dates that I shall zero in on in this final critique. After all, the appearance of these two witnesses in Jerusalem and the appearance of Christ on the Mount of Olives are without question the two main events of this or any 7-year tribulation timeline. In other words, if the two witnesses do not show up in Jerusalem as scheduled in one's 7-year tribulation timeline, and if one is not willing to mention out loud that Christ is to appear on the Mount of Olives at the end of one's 7-year tribulation timeline, then one cannot expect one's viewers to take this 7-year tribulation timeline seriously. To understand the flawed and failed nature of this 7-year tribulation timeline, one needs to go back to March 12, 2020, when this podcaster first posted this video, which was several months after President Nelson's hinge point remarks and less than a month prior to the April 6, 2020 General Conference. Why this is important to note is because all the markers previous to that March 12th date had already passed by according to his timeline. On March 12, 2020 then, the remaining 6 or 7 target dates all had yet to be fulfilled, including the appearance of the two witnesses in Jerusalem, the translation of the saints, enabling them to endure the coming judgments, and Christ's appearance on the Mount of Olives, which this podcaster failed to mention, but which is baked into his timeline. The problem is that over 2 years have now passed since this podcast was posted, and we are halfway into the year 2022. And two things are for certain. The two witnesses in Jerusalem failed to show up, and the saints have not been translated. These are not minor failures, for in the first place, this podcaster claims that the way the faithful saints are going to be able to endure the judgments of the Great Tribulation is by being translated and having their calling and election made sure. And yet here we are in June of 2022, with less than 2 years remaining of the 3.5-year Great Tribulation timeline, and the saints have as yet to be translated. And worse yet, the two witnesses are nowhere to be seen. And in the second place, these are no minor failures, because without the two witnesses' 3.5-year ministry in Jerusalem, there can be no appearance of Christ on the Mount of Olives, in line with the second total solar eclipse, which is to take place on April 8, 2024, and mark the end of this 7-year tribulation timeline. All that remains then is the prediction of Von J. Featherstone that Christ will already be here by the year 2033, which is now less than 11 years away, and which Featherstone himself had backed off of as covered in our previous episode. This, then, is the danger associated with setting future target dates. For when these target dates fail to deliver as advertised, the entire timeline completely unravels and leaves the podcaster scrambling to account for these failures. All of which leads us to rule number 8. Rule number 8 holds that when it comes to developing and presenting prophetic timelines, there is to be no designating future target dates. Which takes us back to episode 1 in this Last Days series, wherein I asked the following question: what's the difference between doomsday prophets and legitimate prophetic timelines? And I pointed out that one of the primary differences is that doomsday prophets set future target dates, while legitimate prophetic timelines refuse to set future target dates and instead set future prophetic markers. In other words, legitimate podcasters wait for a future marker to be fulfilled, such as the coming of Elijah, rather than counting down the days for the next target date to arrive. In any event, this podcaster failed to abide by rule number 8 and has set future target dates all over the place, including the target date of April 6, 2020, for the hinge point or midpoint of his 7-year tribulation timeline. And now this has become very problematic, since, as noted, the 2 witnesses in Jerusalem failed to show up as scheduled, and, as of June 2022, have still failed to show up. Now I make a big deal out of this because it is a big deal, as you shall shortly see. Now the stakes are high as to the credibility of this podcaster's 7-year tribulation timeline. And so what is needed here is a little clarification as to what is going on. And so I have used a bar chart to represent this podcaster's 7-year time frame, with a hinge point between 2 3.5-year periods. Notice that as of June 2022, the red bar has run down to the level on the bar where there is a mere 22 months left before time runs out and the 7-year tribulation time frame comes to an end. Now the podcaster uses the August 21st, 2017 total solar eclipse as the target date for the beginning of the 7-year tribulation, while most Last Days podcasters associate the beginning of sorrows with Daniel's prophecy of a peace treaty that is to be broken midway into it, leading to the abomination of desolation, and which prophecy reads as follows: "And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate." Next we shall see that at the hinge point of the 7-year tribulation, we have the 2 witnesses make their appearance in Jerusalem and testify for 1,260 days. Now, as stated, these 2 witnesses are to prophesy for 1,260 days, which is equivalent to 42 months or 3.5 years. And for further clarification, we can turn to the New Testament Student Manual, chapter 54, covering Revelation chapters 4 through 11, and which reads, "The angel told John that Jerusalem would be trodden underfoot 42 months. 42 months is the equivalent of 3.5 years. Likewise, the 2 witnesses mentioned in verse 3 would prophesy and testify of Jesus Christ for 1,260 days, or approximately 3.5 years. They would be slain, and their bodies would lie in the street for 3.5 days. Next, we see that the podcaster uses the April 8th, 2024 total solar eclipse as the target date for the end of the 7-year tribulation time frame, and which, according to the scriptures, there is to be a great earthquake as Christ stands on Mount Olives, as recorded in Revelation chapter 11, verse 13, and Zechariah chapter 14, verse 4, which reads, And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof, toward the east and toward the west. And there shall be a very great valley, and half of the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it toward the south. Now with this 7-year tribulation time frame having been laid out, we ask, where are the 2 prophesied witnesses in Jerusalem that were scheduled to show up at the hinge point or midpoint of this 7-year tribulation time frame? And the answer is, they're nowhere. That is, they're nowhere to be found, and which completely undermines the credibility of this podcaster's timeline. For we are specifically told that these 2 witnesses will prophesy for 1,260 days, or for the entire 3.5-year time period leading up to the end of the 7-year tribulation time frame, and to Christ's appearance on the Mount of Olives. For these 2 witnesses to show up for less than this 3.5-year time period would contradict the Scriptures, which are quite specific as to how long they will testify in Jerusalem. And so one cannot simply pretend that it is no big deal that these 2 witnesses have not shown up yet and are long overdue. Here then are the 2 graphs showing the hinge point and red bar as of April 6, 2020, and again in June of 2022. We clearly see then that the 2 witnesses failed to show up, and 20 months have now passed, and only 22 months remain of this 3.5-year time frame. Now this failure does not mean his timeline is running out, but that it ran out 20 months ago, as we need all 3.5 years to fulfill this prophecy pertaining to the 2 witnesses in Jerusalem, and not anything less than that. In any event, one might be wondering what this podcaster's response is to these 2 witnesses failing to show up as scheduled. So let's take a moment to answer that question. In March of 2020, this podcaster came out with his 7-year tribulation video. But at that particular date, of March 12, 2020, the hinge point of the 7-year tribulation time frame was still a little less than a month away, and the possibility still existed that these 2 witnesses could show up. But now over 2 years have passed, and so this podcaster put out another podcast to give an explanation to his viewers of the abomination of desolation, which is also a part of the 7-year tribulation time period. And yet we see that as of April 8, 2022, that 2 witnesses have completely failed to show up, and as stated that time ran out 20 months ago. Now this podcaster is well aware that these 2 witnesses have as yet to show up in Jerusalem, and that the 3.5-year time period for them to testify has now been cut nearly in half. And one would think that this no-show would be a crushing blow to this podcaster's entire 7-year tribulation timeline. But instead, we find in this latest podcast a rather bizarre response. For this podcaster is willing to just shrug it all off as though it were of no concern at all, whether or not the 2 witnesses show up for the entire 3.5-year time period, or to simply show up ahead of time just long enough to be killed in the streets, as though this ministry could take place anytime within that 3.5-year time frame. So let me set the stage for what this podcaster has to say, and then I'll let you listen to these bizarre remarks for yourself, so that you'll know that I am not making this up. What the podcaster is doing is reading a short text from a book by the early church apostle Parley P. Pratt, which can be summed up as follows. 2 prophets shall prophesy in Jerusalem, working mighty miracles, for 42 months, and after a struggle of 3.5 years, they will be killed. Now it is while reading through this text about the 3.5-year ministry of these 2 witnesses that this podcaster stops suddenly and comes to this stunning conclusion, and I quote, "So we're not going to really know when they start, right?" A lot of people say, well, if we're in the second half of the 7-year tribulation, why haven't we seen the 2 witnesses? Where does it ever say we're going to know the second the 2 witnesses start their ministry? We always find out that the scriptures say We'll find out when they've ended their ministry, when they've been killed and left in the streets, right? Let's continue." Unquote. And then he goes on without missing a beat. In fact, just 6 or 7 minutes later, he reads the following words of Elder Bruce R. McConkie from the church website, and in reference to the two witnesses' 3.5-year ministry, and I quote, "Their ministry will take place after the latter-day temple has been built in Old Jerusalem, after some of the Jews who dwell there have been converted, and just before Armageddon and the return of the Lord Jesus. How long will they minister in Jerusalem and in the Holy Land? For 3.5 years, the precise time spent by the Lord in his ministry to the ancient Jews. These two prophets would have power to shut heaven, that it rain not in the days of the prophecy, and would be like the prophet Elijah, who sealed the heavens that there was neither dew nor rain for 3.5 years. Unquote. Now, how this podcaster can read this text and keep a straight face is beyond me, for clearly we know how long these two witnesses are to testify in Jerusalem, and we also know that the whole world will be watching, and will therefore also know what is transpiring. For these are mighty miracles they are performing, and not some sideshow off in a corner. And by the way, to say, as he does, that because we do not know the very second these two witnesses are to start their ministry, we cannot know when or how long these two witnesses will testify in Jerusalem, is pure sophistry. With that having been said, let's take a moment to view a short segment of this podcaster's video, and you can draw your own conclusions.
Let's go with another quote from the church website, from a book called A Voice of Warning. Doctrine and Covenants 7715. Who are the two witnesses referred to by John? Elder Parley P. Pratt wrote, John, in the 11th chapter of Revelation, gives us many more particulars concerning the great war in Israel. After the Jews are gathered there, he informs us that after the city and the temple are rebuilt by the Jews, the Gentiles will tread it underfoot 42 months, during which time there will be two prophets continually prophesying and working mighty miracles. So we're not going to really know when they start, right? A lot of people are saying, well, if we're in the second half of the 7-year tribulation, why haven't we seen the two witnesses? Where does it ever say we're going to know the second the two witnesses start their ministry? We always find out that the scriptures say we'll find out when they've ended their ministry, when they've been killed and left in the streets, right? Let's continue. And it seems that the Gentile army shall be hindered from utterly destroying and overthrowing the city, while these two prophets continue. But after a struggle of 3.5 years, they will at length succeed in destroying these two prophets and then overrunning much of the city.
Now, I cannot emphasize enough the bizarre nature of this podcaster's response to the no-show of the two witnesses in Jerusalem within his 7-year tribulation timeline, considering the text he has just read and the text he is about to read. So please pay attention to what he just said, as it is worth repeating. And I quote, "So we're not going to really know when they start, right?" A lot of people say, well, if we're in the second half of the 7-year tribulation, why haven't we seen the two witnesses? Where does it ever say we're going to know the second the two witnesses start their ministry? We always find out that the scriptures say we'll find out when they've ended their ministry, when they've been killed and left in the streets, right? Let's continue. Unquote. To understand why I am so baffled by this podcaster's response to the no-show of these two witnesses, let's skip ahead in the video to where the podcaster now quotes the words of Elder Bruce R. McConkie, and in reference to these two witnesses and their 3.5-year ministry, which flies in the face of everything he just said about not knowing when or how long these two witnesses will testify, prophesy, and perform their mighty miracles in Jerusalem.
Okay, quote from Bruce R. McConkie. Their ministry will take place after the latter-day temple has been built in Old Jerusalem, after some of the Jews who dwelt there have been converted, and just before Armageddon, and the return of the Lord Jesus. How long will they minister in Jerusalem and in the Holy Land? For 3.5 years, the precise time spent by the Lord in his ministry to the ancient Jews.
Now, if you are not as baffled as I am as to the bizarre nature of this podcaster's response to the no-show of these two witnesses at the hinge point of his 7-year tribulation timeline, other than to purposely divert our attention away from the fact that there has been a total breakdown and failure of his timeline, reminding us all that if you live by target dates, you'll die by target dates. And what we have here is a prime example of a podcaster facing a target date that has now come and gone without being fulfilled, and who is trying to shrug it off as no big deal. But it is a big deal, and he can only get away with it if we shrug it off as no big deal as well. In any event, let's move on to another point I want to make as we wind down this episode. So here we are. It is June of 2022. And so I ask one last time, where are the two prophesied witnesses in Jerusalem? They're nowhere. And that is not all. Because with just 22 months left in this podcaster's 7-year tribulation timeline, we discover a whole list of prophetic events that are also missing in action. That is, there is no New Jerusalem, no return of the 10 tribes, no calling of the 144,000 high priests, no council at Adam-ondi-Ahman, no 7 angels pouring out the final 7 judgments, no abomination of desolation, no 2 witnesses in Jerusalem, and no massing of forces leading up to the Battle of Armageddon. And to not see that there is something seriously wrong with this 7-year tribulation timeline is to be oblivious to the obvious. That is, to a flawed and failed timeline, which leads us to our final rule, rule number 9. Rule number 9 holds that when it comes to developing and presenting prophetic timelines, there is to be no doubling down on failed timelines, as we see this podcaster doing now that his future target dates are not delivering as advertised, as we just witnessed in his response to the 2 witnesses not showing up as scheduled. Now, by doubling down, I mean the following. For if you double down, you commit more strongly to a position, typically one that is potentially risky and often foolhardy. In any event, what we have here is a failed timeline, and this podcaster has let it be known that he is willing to double down and even triple down in order to keep his last days narrative going and his 7-year tribulation timeline relevant. This doubling down is not just foolhardy, but can only end in even more embarrassment and disappointment to those who have tied themselves to this particular 7-year tribulation timeline. But having said that, I have one more major objection before I end this critique, so let's turn to that now. Speaking of Christ's appearance upon the Mount of Olives at the end of the 7-year tribulation time frame, Bruce R. McConkie writes, John tells us that in the midst of Armageddon there will be a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake, and so great. And through Ezekiel, the Lord said of that same day, Surely in that day there shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel, and all men that are upon the face of the earth shall shake at my presence. And the mountains shall be thrown down, and the steep places shall fall, and every wall shall fall to the ground. And the Lord shall come, and his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west, and there shall be a very great valley. Now all of this is common knowledge to those who are familiar with the Scriptures and the events of the last days. And so I ask, why was this momentous event skipped over in this podcaster's 7-year tribulation time frame? Could it be that he didn't dare set a future target date for the coming of the Lord, as this would be too controversial and presumptuous? And yet the April 8th, 2024 total solar eclipse is the future target date that he has set for the end of the 7-year tribulation time frame, which coincides with the great earthquake that is to take place as Christ stands upon the Mount of Olives. And so whether this podcaster is comfortable with this prophetic fact or not, Christ's return upon the Mount of Olives is already baked into his 7-year tribulation timeline. And so we see that this podcaster has inadvertently set a target date for Christ's return upon the Mount of Olives. But instead of acknowledging this prophetic event, this podcaster simply skips over Christ's appearance on the Mount of Olives and diverts one's attention away from this climatic event to Vaughn J. Featherstone's 50-year time capsule letter, which predicts that Christ will already be here by the year 2033. But given this timeline, this move is anticlimactic, as it diverts one's attention away from the main event of this 7-year tribulation timeline. For it all comes to a cataclysmic end with this great earthquake and Christ's appearance on the Mount of Olives. And so that is the future target date that should have been highlighted. But instead, Christ's appearance on the Mount of Olives doesn't even make it onto his 7-year tribulation timeline. And so I had to add it myself. In any event, I found all this to be a sad example of a podcaster not willing to take his own 7-year tribulation timeline and target dates seriously. Here then is my final critique of this podcaster's 7-year tribulation timeline. First, as a video podcast, one would have to declare the 7-year tribulation timeline a huge success, as in nearly 1 million views. But as a Last Days timeline, one would have to declare this Last Days podcast a huge failure, as in wrong, wrong, and wrong again, all of which is a direct result of his setting future target dates all over the place. Target dates which have already failed, such as the 2 witnesses in Jerusalem, or will fail in the very near future, such as Christ's appearance on the Mount of Olives in the spring of 2024. Now this success and failure leads me to ask 2 questions. First, was the huge success of this video podcast a direct result of breaking rule number 8, wherein there is to be no designating future target dates? And secondly, does the end is here rhetoric and timeline trend better today than the end is near? Now, if the answer to both of these questions is yes, then one has a formula for a successful YouTube video. That is, set future target dates that clearly indicate that the end is here, as in any day now. We end then with yet another prophetic timeline alert, and in this instance, to alert everyone to the fact that one needs to be very careful in viewing Last Days podcast, for not all Last Days timelines are created equal. But if one is willing to take advantage of the various rules that I have laid out in this critique, then one can use all 9 rules to help separate the wheat from the chaff, as each one of these rules came out of a specific error that is made in putting together Last Days narratives and timelines. In any event, as Last Days podcasters, we need to begin to set some ground rules for our podcast, and all in order to keep each other in check. And I hope the 9 rules that I have identified and illustrated in this critique will be a beneficial start in that direction. As mentioned in a previous episode, episode 9, one of the ways in which spiritual confusion is increased is through the presentation of misleading prophetic timelines that project the coming of the Lord to be any day now. And so it shouldn't surprise you that our next episode is titled, "The World is Not Going to Come to an End Anytime Soon," with a subtitle of Children, Grandchildren, and Great-Grandchildren. Thank you for watching. Push the like button if you enjoyed this episode, and be sure to push the subscribe button. Until next time, stay vigilant, for you know neither the day nor the hour of his coming.